Hi guys, we're back with another book talk, and this is actually our last installment of Encyclopedia Brown, and I got book number 13 out today, and it's called Encyclopedia Brown, The Case of the Midnight Visitors. So, just to recap, Encyclopedia Brown is 10 years old, and his father is the chief of police, and sometimes the chief of police needs Encyclopedia's help. So, what happens in this is they're short mysteries in which Encyclopedia Brown solves the case. But it gives you a chance to think about it before he tells you what the answer is. It's really cool. So let's get started into the Midnight Visitor. Monday evening, Chief Brown sipped his soup slowly. Encyclopedia and his mother knew what that meant. He had his mind on a case. Finally, Mrs. Brown said, "Why don't you tell Leroy about it, dear?" aka Encyclopedia. Chief Brown sighed. "I don't know. This one is an awfully tough case," he said. "It has me beaten." "Leroy has never failed you. Tell him," urged Mrs. Brown. "Very well," said Chief Brown. C.T. Butler was kidnapped from his home last night." Mrs. Brown gasped. Encyclopedia let out a low whistle. C.T. Butler was a millionaire. He owned a string of pizza parlors in 3 states and a big house by the ocean. "Today at noon, Mrs. Butler received a phone call," said Chief Brown. "A man's voice said that her husband was unharmed, but he was being held for a $500,000 ransom. The caller told Mrs. Butler to remain home tomorrow, at which time she would be told by phone where to leave the money." "You hope to capture the kidnappers before they are paid the ransom, Dad?" asked Encyclopedia. "We must," replied Chief Brown grimly. "Kidnappers want money. Once they get it, there's no telling what they might do to their victim." "Poor Mr. Butler," exclaimed Mrs. Brown. "Well, at least you have until tomorrow to find him." "That's too little time," said Chief Brown. "Somebody must have heard or seen something," said Encyclopedia. "Mrs. Butler was some help," said Chief Brown. "From what she told me, it's possible to fit a few clues together in pieces." He took a spoonful of soup, and then he relayed all the police information about the kidnapping to Encyclopedia. Let's get started on the details. Last night, Mr. and Mrs. Butler were in bed watching a late movie on television. A little after midnight, the front door rang. Mr. Butler went downstairs to see who it was. Mrs. Butler turned off the television and listened. She heard him talking to someone she thinks is a man. She couldn't make out the words, but the tone was friendly. Then she heard the sounds of the door closing and the footsteps going into the den. Mr. Butler and his visitor lowered their voices. She could scarcely hear them at all. She went to sleep. She was awakened by the closing of the front door and then went back to sleep. When she awoke in the morning, Mr. Butler wasn't in the house. The front door closed but unlocked. "Wasn't Mrs. Butler worried?" asked Mrs. Brown. "No," answered Chief Brown. "She thought her husband had dressed quietly so he wouldn't wake her and had gone to the office. He sometimes forgets to lock the front door behind him. She didn't report him missing until she got a phone call from the kidnapper." "Wasn't she worried when he didn't return to bed after the visitor left?" said Mrs. Brown. Chief Brown shook his head. "Mr. Butler often gets up at night to work in his den. She thought he had simply remained downstairs to go over some business." You don't have much to work with, dear," said Mrs. Brown. "We know whoever came to the door wasn't a stranger," said Chief Brown. "Mr. Butler would never have let a stranger into his house late at night. I think this is what happened. A visitor spoke with Mr. Butler in the den. Then he opened the window, made Mr. Butler climb into the backyard where other men were waiting. They forced Mr. Butler into the car on a dark street and drove away. The visitor left by the front door." "Wasn't that dangerous?" said Mrs. Brown. Someone might have seen him under the night lights. He probably was afraid that he'd been seen entering the house, so he had to be seen leaving. He was prepared to say that Mr. Butler was still in the house when he left, but no one saw him enter or leave. Then you really don't have any clues, said Mrs. Brown glumly. Only a calendar, replied Chief Brown. He got up from the table, returned with his briefcase, took out the calendar, and on it was written in pencil 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. Mrs. Butler had been in the den last night with her husband just before they went upstairs to the bedroom. She said nothing was different on his desk this morning, but the writing on the calendar, that is, this number. Chief Brown passed the calendar encyclopedia. Make anything of it, son? He inquired. Encyclopedia studied the number and the calendar. He closed his eyes. He was thinking about the clues. He always closed his eyes when he did his hardest thinking. 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. Does Mr. Butler have any enemies? Asked Mrs. Brown. Every wealthy man has enemies, said Chief Brown. He is known to have argued with Arthur Jason, John McNear, and Matt Short. There are probably a dozen others. I argue with my closest friends, objected Mrs. Brown, and I have not been kidnapped. Encyclopedia opened his eyes. He asked his one question. He seldom needed more than one question to break a case that his father brought home to dinner. Was there any paper on Mr. Butler's desk? Just a small pad by the telephone, said Chief Brown, but it was blank. Is that a clue, Leroy? Said Mrs. Brown anxiously. Yes, said Encyclopedia. When the visitor went to open the window, Mr. Butler seized the moment to write this number on the calendar. What does it mean? Asked Mrs. Brown. It tells us the visitor's name, said Encyclopedia. The rest should be easy, right, Dad? What was the visitor's name? So remember our clue is 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, and it's written on the calendar. So you can pause the video right now if you want to think about which the answer is, okay? Okay, we're back. And here is the solution. Mr. Butler didn't dare write down the name of a kidnapper. The kidnapper might have seen it, so he wrote the number 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. If it had been the entire clue, however, he would have written it on the pad by the telephone, not on the calendar. Encyclopedia saw the number that the number stood for the 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th, and 11th months of the year. July, August, September, October, November. Taking the first letter of each month, he discovered that Mr. Butler had written Jason. That night, Chief Brown questioned Arthur Jason, who secretly and unjustly blamed Mr. Butler for his business troubles. Jason broke down and led the police to the garage where Mr. Butler was being held. Did you guys get it? Well, I hope you've enjoyed this installment of Encyclopedia Brown. Like I said, we've got lots of different ones, and they've got about 10 short stories in each book. So thank you for listening. See you in September. Bye.